more I deal with.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Jason Jay. I'm a senior lecturer here and director of the Sustainability Initiative at MIT Sloan. Part of our work here is to build a community of innovators for sustainability out of our students and alumni, our faculty and researchers, and our allies across sectors. And Reunion every year is a fantastic event for us because it's a chance to bring together our alumni, many of whom are working actively in sustainability, many of whom have brought a sustainability lens to their work, whether or not it's a formal part of their role or their company or organization. So what we're going to do today is we have a great panel of alumni of the Sloan School of Management, all of whom are involved in the domain of sustainability, environment, energy, and what I'll do is give them a chance to share a bit about the work that they do, the journey that's brought them there, the role that MIT Sloan has played in that journey, and their observations about the space, about the field. We'll have a little bit of conversation about that, but I want to make sure to get pretty quickly into interaction across the audience here. Because I'm just looking across the faces here, I recognize some familiar folks, many of whom are actually working in the sustainability domain as we speak. So we want to get this to be a conversation altogether. So I'm going to introduce my panelists quickly. So Drew Morales is an MBA 2015. He's an ESG analyst at Wellington Asset Management. Eric Seale is an SM86, Senior Vice President of Warren and Selbert, Inc., which is a financial software firm involved in the renewable energy space. Lily Russell is an MBA 11, founder of Explain the Chain, and an adjunct professor at Bard College. And Michael Thompson, SM81, is the executive director for business development for Northland Power, which is a renewable energy project developer. So I'll get started with you, Drew. I would like you to just share, what does it mean to be an ESG analyst? What does that phrase, what does that acronym mean for those who may not be familiar? And how does that fit into what Wellington Management does?
Sure. So thanks, first of all, for having me here. Very, very honored to be here. So ESG analyst, that stands for Environmental, Social, and Corporate Governance Analyst, which I am aware is a lot of words that could mean a lot or could mean very little. So I would say succinctly, what I do, or rather what our team does, is we think about things that have a cost, but maybe don't yet have a price. And so what we are looking at are the sort of non-financial factors that exist around companies and in markets that have a potentially material financial impact. And we think about how we integrate that into our investment process, both in terms of how it makes you think about the valuation of companies, but also how you might think about altering your investment strategy, and just generally engaging with companies as well to work with them to help them understand their exposures. It's sort of in an ideal situation, it's kind of a virtuous cycle where we help them understand these elements of or risk and opportunity exposure better, and then they can improve on them and become kind of better investments for us.
So how do you end up getting a job as an ESG analyst at an investment firm? What was the trajectory for you, Drew?
So the longer term trajectory, I was actually, before Sloan, I was in the consulting world first, and then in the corporate world. I was working with a large consumer goods company in the food and beverage space based out of Texas. And basically, the road that got me to here was at that company, we were not a bad sustainability actor by any means, but I would say that we were kind of your average sustainability, or your average company when it came to sustainability. We had a sustainability person that was sort of there and did things that made everybody feel good, but we weren't maybe doing anything incredibly material. And one day we had this meeting with our with a woman who was our head animal scientist, and she had with her a number of, sorry, I should mention that, I think I mentioned we were in the food and beverage industry, but we had a heavy exposure in the dairy foods industry. So we had a lot of animals that were part of our supply chain. And she, along with a number of the farmers on staff, or rather the agricultural experts on staff, were making the case for their continued oversight and authority in the company. And basically took a room full of skeptics and made them believers in her specific role by saying, you might not care a lot about the animals or the farms or what happens on them, but I promise you there are a lot of people in the market who do care about what happens to those animals and happens on those farms. And the distance between your business and those people in the market is getting shorter and shorter every day. So you need to think about that. And I think that was kind of a revelatory moment for me, where I realized that there was a way to think about these issues that was not just framing them as a sustainability project that you did to make everybody feel good about sustainability. There was a world in which you could actually make these changes because they were the right thing to do for the business and happened to also be the right thing to do for kind of society as a whole.
Got it. Great. Eric, let's move on to you. So you're the Senior Vice President of Warren & Selbert. Tell us a little bit about your business and how it touches on sustainability topics.
Sure. Our company is a small company. We're 12 people in Santa Barbara. We've been around a long time. I joined the company 30 years ago out of Sloan. Sloan really got me to this company, to this job. And the company had already been in existence for 15 years before that. What we've done all along is provide software. And our software analyzes transactions our clients do in asset finance. So any big asset is often financed, say with a lease. That asset can be an aircraft. It can be a building, a hard asset. Most recently, renewable assets are what our clients are financing. So that brought us into solar and wind primarily, also geothermal and smaller renewable markets. And really, as a company, we have always followed our clients into the industries and into the financing structures that they do. So in the last 5 to 10 years, we've learned a lot about solar, learned a lot about wind. Our clients really are our teachers that way. What we do for them is provide the software that they need to come up with structures that they can finance these assets with, either whether they're giant wind farms or solar farms or solar rooftop.
Got it. So it's from the sort of smaller scale distributed energy all the way to the big megawatt utility scale type of projects. Got it.
Right.
And so so when you say your client, you're driven by your clients or customers, what kind of players would those be?
Our clients are the people who participate in the deals. So they could be the developers of the renewable assets, or they could be the investors in those assets on either side, or they could be advisors to those investors or developers, or they could be lenders into the deals. Anybody who has a hand in the transaction and a stake in knowing that the numbers are right are going to want to use our program, and they share information with each other, but it's trust and verify.
Got it. Got it. And was there a particular sort of skill set that you had to develop to do this kind of work?
Well, I started out as a software guy, just straight CS. Came to Sloan and concentrated in finance, became interested in that particular area, kind of got some credibility with employers, enough that Warren & Selbert hired me. Jim Selbert's in the audience today. He's a Sloan alum also.
Welcome.
Class of 66, 50th reunion, pretty cool.
Excellent.
Yeah. So really, it got me over the hump. It got me from working for Data General, which is a no longer mini computer company in Westboro, Mass, to Santa Barbara, California, working in a small firm where I've been 30 years. So it made the turn for me personally.
Excellent. Lily, you want to share a bit about the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So my thing is supply chain and sustainability, so a lot of supply chain risk and transparency. Following Sloan, so I was at class of 2011. I'm my 5-year. Certainly does not feel like 50. It feels like 5 days. But following Sloan, I went to Deloitte and went into their supply chain practice area and led a lot of pretty much all of their supply chain risk and transparency work. So really just the heart of supply chain sustainability. So a lot of my clients, like the Nikes and Walmarts of the world, working on their more sensitive social and environmental issues at the farm and factory level. Super, super cool work. For me, it was a perfect blend of working with the C-suite and also the factory and farm level, and really tied together my sort of philanthropic international development past with the MBA experience. And then about 2 years in, this idea that I had was just really nagging at me, and the consulting miles were also nagging, and I just couldn't ignore this idea. And it's so awesome to be in this room right now because I got the idea standing about there 5.5 years ago. So the idea is that I felt like, as sexy as it is to talk to the C-suite and work with the C-suite about these issues, kids are where it's at. And there's so much opportunity to teach kids the story of things and how things work and how things are made in order to ideally influence their consumer and leadership behavior in the future. So my hypothesis is a big generational mindset shift, but if I can get kids super excited about how things are made, then I won't have to be teaching the C-suite supply chain 101 when they're already executives. Like, they'll already have that ingrained in them. So after a series of meetings, I convinced Deloitte to give me a leave of absence to write a children's book. Total 180, but actually not, because so much of what I was doing was supply chain 101. So left to write a children's book about how a teddy bear is made, so the supply chain of a teddy bear. And I had 6 months to do it, and right the week that I was going to make my decision about whether or not to go back to Deloitte, Jason called me with an opportunity to work with the sustainability initiative, and it was just, it was a total vote of confidence that I can go do my own thing, and I took that opportunity to work with Jason and Sloan, and ultimately didn't go back to Deloitte. So what am I doing now? I'm still working on the book. Whew. Publishing is pretty archaic, takes a lot of time and patience, but I've learned a ton about a very old school industry, but reading is so fundamental, so I'm gonna stick with it. So yeah, I'm still working on the book. I actually have a Sloan intern this summer to ideate new product concepts. So also was able to get the intern through another program through the Sustainability Initiative. So that's really cool tie-in for me to help support the journey. And I'm also teaching at Bard College. They have an MBA program in sustainability, and I teach operations and leading change, which I've basically turned into their systems thinking course, which has been really, really fun to kind of influence that mindset at Bard. And I continue to consult. So basically, I'm working with 3 different age groups: kids, MBAs, and the C-suite still, all around supply chain and sustainability.
Excellent. I have a son who just turned 6 yesterday, and I've pilot tested Lily's material. She has exercises to get kids thinking about where things come from and where they go and what the life cycle is, which leads to fantastic conversation. So
but I got to get it out before he turns too old.
I know. He's waiting for your book.
Yeah.
When's it coming out?
Oh.
So never ask an author when their book is coming out, please.
Actually, my boyfriend's sitting there. You can ask him that question. Yeah.
Great. Michael, you want to say a bit about Northland Power and the work that you do?
Okay, I'll start with a little bit of background. I'm class of 1981, so that's 35 years, and I'm happy to tell you that a number of us from the class are here, came back.
So show of hands, we're the 81s.
So, no, I left in 81 with a finance track, so I'm going to do a little bit of a circle to get where I got. Went into banking, then investment banking in the energy sector, in the electric power energy sector, in the independent power electric power sector. So I spent a long period of my time helping my clients finance privately owned or non-utility, non-governmental competitive power plants in the US and around the world. A lot of time figuring out how to make this one compete, how to get this price low enough so people will want it. Supply chain. What's the best supply chain? What's the best location? Because you didn't have in those days you only got to sell power to the utility if you gave them a better deal than they otherwise had. There was a law in the books that said they had to buy from you at a fair price. So I learned a lot about how to make something competitively and serve a need, but make it at a price that worked for everyone. And so over the years, I spent a lot of time in banking. Then I moved to the developer side and been working with a number of developers. Right now, I'm working with a large developer that is a renewable energy developer that is doing some projects. Just did a couple of large projects in Europe. One was a $2.8 billion single wind farm project. So one of the things I've learned about in the renewable sector is to make the renewable energy sector work. It's got to be sustainable, meaning it's got to be delivered to the customers at a competitive price. It can't just be expensive. So I'm working on sustainability of the renewable energy sector so that the renewable energy can be, sustainable power. So I'm having a great time focusing on renewable energy, mostly wind right at the moment, mostly large-scale wind. So that's what I'm doing. A little bit of a circle.
Good. And how would you describe the sort of role that MIT Sloan or your experience here sort of played in that? You mentioned getting the finance track as a MBA student.
Well, finance track, but I guess we figured out how to make, if there's a problem, if a problem, this plant is too expensive, how do you solve it? So instead of getting sort of thick-headed and say, I'm not going to move it, we say, no, let's move it. Let's put it over there. Let's solve this problem to make this thing work. Let's not put it in someone's backyard. Let's make the project work at the lowest cost. So it was really this critical thinking, how to solve the problems, I think.
Excellent. So I was going to ask my panelists to just share some observations and insights about the sustainability field. Before I do that, I want to just take a moment and gather some questions and from the audience. And I'm just going to, what I'll do is just gather a few of them so we have some topics for talking points as we go through the group. Yeah, Daryl?
I'm curious about your experience, Michael, in Europe versus the US and what the mentality is, not only Europe, but the rest of the world as relates to this topic versus here and any other panels.
Great. So Europe versus US perspectives. Yeah, in the back?
I'm interested in sustainability in the transportation segment, in particular what new initiatives we should investigate.
Okay, in transportation, yeah, go ahead.
I'm interested in how you and your clients are thinking about climate change. What's the level of urgency?
Yep.
I'm interested in how the regulatory system causes perturbations in the accounting system for the complete cycle of sustainability, and how this might have a difference in the rapid change as the regulatory environment suddenly shifts. How does that ratchet through your system?
Yep.
I have a question about the use and utility of the ESG indices that are out there in the financial world.
Excellent. Yeah, over there.
If I may, sort of how the ESG are kind of integrated with the investment side.
The market for green infrastructure bonds and social impact investing and how that relates to sustainability.
Yep.
I'm interested in reconciling the scientific definition of sustainability as in planetary boundaries.
Yes.
And the ones that the corporations use, which is triple P, triple E,
yep,
etc.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. You want to take one more?
In Europe, many countries like Spain, Italy, Greece, France have been subsidizing wind and solar energy to encourage the creation of additional sources of energy. I assume this is because the technology doesn't exist to make them viable by themselves. Does the panel think that over a short period of time, this will no longer be necessary?
Okay, so this is great. I'm going to pause here. So this is fantastic. So we're not going to be able to cover all these topics, and so therefore, what I'm going to do is invite all of you to join us for a lunch tomorrow here on as part of the reunion program, where we'll have a networking lunch on sustainability, and it'll be a chance for sort of small group conversations on some of these more specialized topics. Bethany Patton is here, who's our associate director in charge of alumni engagement, and myself will both be here tomorrow to sort of continue that conversation. But there are a few of these threads that I would really like to pick up with the panelists. So the first thing I'd like to do is there's kind of a cluster here around the renewable energy business. Both, what does it look like in the U.S. versus Europe? How does climate change sort of policy imperatives, accelerate or not that field? What does that look like? And are there green infrastructure bonds or other forms of financing that are enabling or accelerating that space, which maybe I'll put to Eric and Michael since you're working very actively, but Drew and Lily, you may have observations about it as well.
I'm interested in your last point about the incentives for renewables. You mentioned in Europe, they also exist in the US at a federal level and in some states. Since there's a variety of incentives, there have been experiments really done in different locations with different incentives. Some have gone well and some have not gone well. Spain, as an example, I think really fell off a cliff at a point where, but as far as the U.S., I do find it interesting that just in the arc of an industry, and really, I really shouldn't do it that way. I should do it that way. The arc, the growth of an industry, incentives make sense initially. In time, the idea is that the cost of energy from these new sources will be cost competitive. They talk about grid parity. And I do see that happening with solar in particular, also with wind. Those federal credits were recently renewed for solar and wind and some of the other renewable areas. But they're in a time frame that is going to expire in 3 to 5 years, depending. And by that time, I really do expect them to be at grid parity, and I really hope that they will go away, the incentives, so that the industries can kind of continue on their own. Makes sense for the industry. I think it makes sense for the people financing the industry too.
Michael, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, the difference between Europe and the States, there's lots of little differences. At the end of the day, they really don't matter because the objective is to build large-scale renewable energy plants that, when I say large scale, I mean very large scale, to replace all the various units that we're retiring. So Europe's going that direction, we're going that direction. Government has more involvement there. Regulations are different, but you just, once again, you strip that down and say you're building the most efficient power plant you can, meeting the needs of the customers, and just work through all those things.
Yep.
So I don't see that much of a difference between the two. I agree with the idea about, I mean, Europe's ahead of us a little bit on this, and they are, I can't remember the number, but 10 gigawatts of offshore wind, for example. And I look at this, this country's a lot larger. When this kicks off, when the next generation of solar, next generation of wind kicks off, it's going to be done on a large scale. It is probably going to work so fast, it's going to pass the subsidies. Mm-hmm. The subsidies are almost going to get in the way because they're.
And we've been hearing about large-scale utility deals in solar being done for 4 cents a kilowatt hour or even less, which as levelized cost of energy, which is just a completely game-changing price. So things moving down the cost curve quickly.
I had read somewhere about the fact that if the price of storage gets down far enough in California, then the vehicle fleets might flip to to electricity, which then suddenly changes the need for electricity there.
Yeah. Yep. We had a couple of questions in the audience around the ESG indices and sort of the financing landscape. One of you have observations about sort of the state of play in that whole field and where it's going.
Sure. So I think ESG is first and foremost a relatively new space. And there's still a great deal of confusion, even amongst investors who use it on a daily basis, between sort of the original iteration of it, which was SRI, or socially responsible investing, and ESG, which is actually something very different. So SRI was more of an exclusionary form of investing that said, we don't like tobacco, so we won't invest in it, or we don't like coal, so we won't invest in it. And the point of ESG is actually somewhat different, which is to try to look at a comparable set of metrics across companies that attempt to measure performance on the same types of attributes and judge who is doing better or worse at these attributes, and then from there, sort of optimize accordingly. On that note, then, there have been a number of new players who have come into the market, some pre-existing, such as MSCI, who has become something of a current leader in producing ESG data, and some new entrants, such as a company called Sustainalytics. There are some governance-specific indices, such as Glass Lewis, ISS, et cetera. But anyway, you have all of these new traditional and new players who are now seeking to build out these indices that are attempting to kind of explain, record, and report these attributes in the best way they possibly can and turn them into something meaningful and digestible. I mean, if we're being very honest, I think this is a great start, but it is a very early iteration of it. It is reliant heavily on self-reported data from companies. Much of it is not standardized in any way. I think one of the best things that can happen would be for something such as SASB, which Professor Eccles, who taught here last semester and is at Harvard Business School, is working on, for even if not SASB, for a comparable organization. Well, let's say SASB,
SASB is
because we like Bob.
Well, right. The SASB is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. So it's designed to be a parallel to FASB, which is the Financial Accounting Standards Board. And SASB is currently being co-chaired by Michael Bloomberg and Nancy Shapiro, who's the former head of the SEC, and the former head of FASB is on the board as well. So it's an effort to try to create standardization around the information that companies report about sustainability on the most material factors for their business, to go back to your Dean Food story, and to shore up the quality of information that we use in these kinds of investment processes.
Yeah. So, and thank you for explaining that. Sorry, I should have explained what SASB is. But I think the point then, to bring it all to a fine point, is that these indices are only as good as the data that they're getting right now, and the data is ultimately determined by what companies are reporting and how they're reporting it, and how they're being audited on their reporting. So, again, they're a great start. But the more that we can do to advance the standards to which companies are held when they pull together this data and they report it, I think the better off people are going to be. And I would just add as a final note that it sounds to some, I think, crazy or overly burdensome, but I mean, it's worth remembering that there was a time not too long ago when many of you were still in business school, that we didn't have, or companies weren't required to report revenue in a meaningful way. And so to think that we've come, that far, or something that seems so obvious to us at this point was not a requirement so recently, it actually then starts to seem not so crazy that maybe we should ask companies to be a bit more accountable and transparent about how many emissions they produce or what their supply chain looks like.
We're also seeing, since this is MIT, there's also some really interesting technological approaches to this. So we've seen a couple of companies pop up, like True Value Labs and eRevalue, which are using kind of machine learning, artificial intelligence, big data techniques to essentially scrape the web for information about ESG risks on companies and produce kind of real-time ESG indices that don't rely on self-reported data by companies, but on other data sources. But we don't yet know how useful or valid that those sources are going to be. I don't know, Lily, do you have any observations about kind of this ESG space from your Deloitte time, or just in general in the sustainability field?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually an observation about the opposite of ESG. I loved what Drew said about we're starting to understand the costs, but we don't yet have prices for it. A lot of what I saw in my clients is this craving and desire to quantify impact. And somebody over there asked about climate change. And companies are definitely facing that. Like Toyota lost 6 months in their supply chain with a tsunami disruption, not because all their suppliers are completely wiped out, only because some were, and they didn't have enough transparency in their supply chain to know where to then divert their operations. So to answer the climate change question, not yet the ESG question, companies are definitely feeling those effects in contingency planning in their supply chain. As it relates to ESG, so much of this conversation is around how do we quantify, what are the numbers, how do we understand the cost and the balance sheet of renewable energy, and a lot of it is 1 + 1 = 2. We want to strive for that number and how to quantify it, and I think a lot of companies are seeing, my experience is that a lot of the CPG apparel retailer experiencing socially driven impacts, so things like what if child labor is discovered in your supply chain, any of the human rights labor aspects that can completely disrupt their brand and or supply chain. And there is absolutely no 1 + 1 = 2 answer for that yet. And I think that's a trend I see, is that we're starting to really latch onto some things to quantify. The social side is a whole new domain, and I'd be really curious if that's getting folded into your work at all too. But
Yeah, so the social side is I mean, one of the three, but also incredibly relevant. And I think it's important to note that your use of the garment industry is an excellent one, because different industries are more heavily exposed to different factors. So if any of you have seen it, there was a study recently published at Harvard Business School about the first evidence of materiality that looked at companies incorporating ESG factors into their strategies, and basically finding that the ones who there was not uniform outperformance among those who had paid more attention to ESG factors. Rather, it was the ones who had incorporated the right ESG factors, so they focused on the things that were most material to their business. And so I think social is a great example where you might not find it to be as relevant in, let's say, the utilities industry, where they're going to face far greater exposure to carbon taxes, things of that nature. But in the garment industry, where things like child labor in the supply chain are still a very serious and real risk, then, or just ask Verizon, who just suffered a series of hits to their stock price because of the ongoing labor relations issues. Those social matters and being able to be it predict them, account for them, control for them are becoming hugely relevant.
I think we'll take this moment to grab a couple more questions from the audience. Any others? Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to follow up on the generational. You mentioned you're actually working with 3 different generations. Do you have an overall feel for the response to the sustainability issues across those? Could you sort of compare and contrast what you're seeing?
Yeah, I'll start with business school students. Like, sustainability is hot, right? Everybody wants a job. I think every week I get a handful of emails wanting to talk about how to get into sustainability. So I think in the current millennial space, it's really hot. I'd say in the older sort of leadership C-suite space, it's not about sustainability or the S word. It's you said it. It's like just making your operation more efficient. And then you can weave in, okay, there's a sustainable story there. I'd say the mindset in an older generation is much more about efficiency, which I believe is sustainability, less so about sustainability. And then kids, hopefully they love it, right? Because that's what I'm trying to dedicate my career to. But I will say, I think I have a prediction and a hope for the future, that I hope that jobs with the title sustainability go away. I'm probably, maybe going to make some enemies here. And I'll say this specific to retail, CPG, apparel type of space, because it needs to be driven from so many other parts of an organization. And, one client I'm working with right now, the project started with the chief marketing officer saying, we want to tell the story of our food. And it's now, a year later, being led by the chief supply chain officer, because it's like, well, we need to know the story of our food before we tell it. And so I really do hope that in the future that there actually isn't a role for sustainability. It's just much like it's all driven into knowing your business.
And I want to underscore what Lily said about the generational facet. So, where Bethany and I sit here at the Sloan School is we have students coming into Sloan with interest in sustainability, and they pursue what we have to offer, which is 48 electives across MIT in sustainability topics. We have a sustainability certificate program, which you can do on top of your MBA or other master's level program. And we've just seen an explosive growth in interest in these offerings. In this year's graduating class of 16, more than a third of our students from Sloan, so about 250 or so, had taken 3 or more electives in sustainability. 80% of them had taken at least one. And our sustainability certificate, which Lily graduated from in 11 and Drew graduated in 15, last year we hit a record year of sustainability certificate grads. We had 24. And a couple weeks ago, we just graduated 41.
What does certificate mean? Is that a minor?
It's like a minor, basically, right? You have to take 6 or 7 classes in sustainability as part of your electives during your time as an MBA or a Sloan Fellow or a Technology and Policy Program student. So we're seeing tremendous interest in this. And what we're seeing is that our students, I mean, to Lily's point, there's some of them who want to have sustainability in their job title. But more so, what they're looking for is they're looking for companies who are taking these things seriously, and they're looking to go play the kinds of roles that MBA students can go play, as heads of supply chain or heads of business development, or to found new companies in the renewable energy space. But where they're looking to be in purpose-driven, mission-driven companies, and that's a really strong generational phenomenon. And what it means for the generation of managers is that if you want access to this talent, you have to be able to tell this story. And while there's a tremendous business value driver around efficiency and around risk mitigation, there's another sort of very, sometimes more difficult to quantify, but really dramatic aspect in sort of the war for talent to get students who are passionate about these topics and who know that your company is doing something real and that will have an impact on these issues.
I also think technology and globalization has forced us to get more transparent in our supply chain. Like, you can't hide from certain things like child labor. Nobody wants child labor to happen, but now it's much more visible, and things like that are driving it too.
Yep. Go ahead in the back.
I think there are a couple of enemies of sustainability. One is management incentive schemes, and the second is that most of this work is in the staff and not in the line. In other words, the people who are graduating are finding staff jobs. So I would just like to hear your experience on, these two stories about the contest between management incentive schemes, which tend to be short-term, not long-term, and the story about where it's located in the organization.
Do you guys want to offer thoughts on that?
Oh, on my side, it's a little different than that. To me, to get an industry into a sustainable space where it is now, it's not just using up resources, it's more sustainable. One of the things that I think is important is it can't be done on a small scale. You have to think large while you say there are so many changes in the supply chain. There's so many adjustments we need to do it that way rather than this way. This way is not good. That way is sustainable. You can't do it small. You have to do it big, which means you have to look way far forward. You have to involve all sorts of people into it. And said, if we build things on a massive scale, we'll drive the economies of scale down. We'll change the way the supply chain works. We'll get to that point. And sort of that's kind of how I think. And I don't think we should look at this as a small thing.
Yes.
It's. And so it sort of includes everybody in that case.
I
Yeah.
don't think incentive schemes are a small thing. I just feel that it's one of the real blockages in most companies.
It is,
becoming sustainable.
and the incentive schemes go all the way up the chain to the capital markets, right? What's really interesting that we're seeing is that companies have a lot more leeway to shape the short-term versus long-term pressures that they're under than we've previously realized. So, for example, following the SASB guidelines, some companies are starting to do integrated reporting, where they report on both their financial and non-financial performance dimensions together. A recent study by George Serafim and Bob Eccles up at HBS showed that when companies start doing integrated reporting, their investor base changes. It moves from short-term hold managers to longer-term asset categories like pension funds and endowments. And so what that means is that even these staff people, right, who are working on things like sustainability reporting may actually be able to have a pretty dramatic impact on the entire context of what the firm is doing and what pressures it's under. Now, of course, it's a lot easier to do that if you're in the C-suite, right? When Paul Pullman started at Unilever, he went to their shareholders and said, I don't work for you. I'm going to abolish quarterly guidance because it orients us towards short term, and that also shifted the investor base. And I think that's what a lot of this does, right? Is it just sort of shifts the conversation and shifts the perspective toward a longer term vision for what capitalism can achieve, for what companies can achieve, and then creates, and then we start to create the management practices around our supply chains and our operations, and we start to incorporate technologies that take that longer term view in mind. And that's really I would say what this group of people is up to. It's what our alumni community is up to. It's what our sustainability initiative is up to, is working to fundamentally change the conversation, to understand that there is an alignment between creating business value and attacking these big challenges, so that we try to find the intersections between where we can get within planetary boundaries and where we can create business value. I think the whole effort around our initiative is to try to train a generation of managers and then connect them and support them with each other in a kind of long green line of advocacy and action and innovation around sustainability. And that's exactly what events like this are supposed to do. As I mentioned, tomorrow we're going to continue this conversation with one of the networking boxed lunches on the program is focused on sustainability. I believe the room that we'll be in will be posted on the outside, and it'll be a chance for us to continue these conversations on all the topics that we identified, from the definitions of sustainability to their incorporation and investment to specific sectors and domains like renewable energy, and we'll be there to be part of that conversation. So thank you all for being a part of the event, and I wish you a great rest of your reunion.